Okay, so I work mostly in evolutionary biology. That's my core area of research these days. So I'll introduce to you a basic quantity, which is, most of you will recognize soon. Okay, and I'll then very briefly give a specific question and a very recent result, which is like 3 weeks old. Okay, so here is the, so just like in physics, we have these, fundamental forces, 4 fundamental forces we know. So something like that is known in evolution as well. So these are sort of 4 broad categories of processes which have been identified over a century or so. So some of them you all know. One is natural selection, which just says that there is variation in the population, and the good variants, the variants which are good in a particular environment, will be selected. So the fitter one to that particular environment will win the game. Okay, so that's natural selection. Mutation, it simply means change. So when a reproduction event happens, it's an error-prone process. The genome of the offspring is not identical to that of the parent. There are some changes. That's mutation. So these two, all of you have some idea about. But what is perhaps not realized or not so widely known is that evolution is a stochastic process. Okay, so that's an important thing. And most of the situations, one has to take stochasticity into account. And that's where statistical physics people could contribute. Okay, so then there's a last category about population structure, which is sort of a broad, category which says whether the system is sexual, asexual, haploid, diploid, is it a well-mixed population, etc., etc. Okay, so these are sort of 4 broad processes which I'll put in a big model if I like, depending on the situation. Today, however, I'll focus only on 2 of them: selection and stochasticity. So as I said, selection you already have some idea about. Let me describe what I mean by stochasticity in these models. Okay, so here's a little cartoon. So in this literature, it's called random genetic drift. So here's a little example. So I'm thinking of a microbial population, and in the parent generation, I have these 5 individuals. Let's say the light colored, the open symbols have certain fitness, and the darker ones are fitter. They have a larger fitness. They both, all of them divide. So instead of 5, I now have, because of the production, 10 individuals. Now, there is enough food in the petri dish for just 5 individuals. So half of the population has to die. So how does that work? So what one does is to say, okay, fine, each of these offspring will be chosen with the probability proportional to the fitness of the parent. So you would expect, because these dark ones are fitter, you would expect that they are likely to survive more in the next generation. But since it's stochastic, it's not necessary, right? So I had these 10 individuals, a random number is thrown, and this happened to die, and this also happened to die. So that means this parent had no offspring, although it was fit. Second one happened to have both offspring survive, and the third, fourth, fifth also had 1 offspring survive, and so on. So that's what we mean by selection, and the kind of noise we are thinking about is this demographic noise. So that's what it's called random genetic drift in this business. Okay, so let me just, I have some detailed model, etc. Don't worry too much about that. But, so just I have these 5 individuals again, and the dark one is the fitter one, as in the previous slide. And I just run a little simulation. Let's imagine doing a simulation. So this guy has more offspring, 3, let's say. This ones didn't have any, and so on, and it just carries on. There's no mutation, just selection and stochastic noise. So at the end of the day, we find that perhaps all the 5 individuals are fit. That's the end of the game. Okay, so because the population structure is not going to change after this point. So this is what you would expect intuitively. That is, at large times, all the individuals will be the fitter ones. However, because of noise, this can also happen, right? That all the beneficial mutation, the fitter one got lost. None of the individuals were carrying this dark, were the dark ones. That is, they were not carrying beneficial mutation. So here's this little moral, and it's a very classic result in the subject, okay, which says beneficial mutations can get lost. There's no guarantee. It is not guaranteed that beneficial mutation would spread in the population. It's a bit like everyday experience in life, you don't have to be just good. You also have to be lucky. Okay? And similarly, deleterious mutations, that is bad mutations, they can spread. So it's a very old result, and there are expressions, etc. Let me not tell you that. Just keep this little moral in mind. Okay, so the simple result was that the beneficial mutation need not spread. So you could ask, what's the chance that it would spread? Because it's not certain that it would. So now, the two pictures that I showed you, I'm sure you have recognized that those two were nothing but the absorbing states. So that means, as a physicist, you will recognize that I'm talking about a system which has two absorbing states, and the question is simply this: what is the chance that the system winds up into one of the absorbing states, right? So that's a standard quantity, which is, physicists are very familiar with, but it's a very important input. It's a rather building block when we want to construct stochastic models of adaptation. So that's why I wanted to focus on just this quantity. I wanted to introduce this quantity to you. Okay, so how does one calculate it? There are a couple of methods. Again, this is very familiar to all of you. You just write a backward Fokker-Planck equation, and you can basically work out things, quite a lot of it. But when I have complex models, which have lots of stuff, these equations are typically multidimensional, and it's very hard to make any analytical progress. A more intuitive and also fruitful method is what is called branching process. So here's a simple, cartoon, but again, this has to be generalized in order to apply to more realistic models. So, okay, so these are sort of two methods that we use to calculate this fixation probability. So my group has been involved in calculating these things for various different models, and so that's because it's an important input to realistic things. Okay, so I'll just now give you an example as an application of these quantities that we calculate. So what do we learn from them? So here is one problem which is has been called one of the most enduring puzzles in evolutionary biology, which is origin and maintenance of sex. So the question is this: why is sexual reproduction so common? So millions of species that we know, they all have genetic mixing. So that's what I mean by sex here. It just means two individuals, they will have, the genetic material will get mixed to produce an offspring. That's what I mean by sex in this talk today. Okay? Why is it so common? Because you see, it's a risky process. It's an expensive process because you have to need time and energy to find a mate. The mate could have disease, and per individual, asexuals produce two offspring, whereas sexuals produce only one. So there are all these costs that are associated with sex. Yet, obligate asexuals, that is, which do not have any genetic mixing, that number is like maybe a few hundred out of the millions of species that we know of. So that's basically non-existent. So there's been this big question in the subject for almost like more than 100 years, that why is sex so common? Why is sexual reproduction so common? And there have been lots of arguments for this. So one of them I'll present here. So the argument is, again, sort of oldish argument, which says the following. It says, suppose we have a sexually reproducing population. Here's another individual, which has this dark one again as a beneficial mutation. Another individual, which also has this hatched one as a beneficial mutation. Because sex here means genetic mixing, in the same individual, two beneficial mutations can combine, okay? And therefore aid the adaptation of the population, etc. So that can happen in sexual population. But in asexual population, this guy has to wait for a next hit, that is, for the next beneficial mutation to occur, which would slow it down, its rate of adaptation, etc. will be slow. That's a sort of argument that has been, been there for a long time. And the thrust of this subject is to make these qualitative arguments into some sort of a quantitative analysis. So the argument suggests that the beneficial mutation is less likely to spread in an asexual population. So how do I quantify that? Will we just look at this fixation probability? That means we expect that this p-fix asex should be smaller than p-fix sex, right? That's the expectation. I mean, that's what you would expect. And then how much is it small? Is it, and how does it depend upon the parameters, right? So this has been studied numerically, previous works. And basically what I have been able to do recently is to obtain a certain expression for it. So I haven't told you the details of the model, that's why I'm not showing you any expressions. So I just want to show you this orange points that are from a numerics of a full-fledged model, and this blue ones are my analytical answers. So it's some double exponential type of function. Okay, so let me not worry about that, but here. Okay, so what is this graph shows is the relative fixation probability, and as I said, we expect it to be less than 1. But it's, so what it says is there's a parameter regime in which sex and asex are, more or less good, but there is a parameter regime where asexuality is pretty bad because, this fixation probability is very low. Okay, so the first question that I expect you would ask me is that what about experiments? Are these numbers, etc., consistent with experiments? So there are some indications that they make sense experimentally, but I'm also aware that there are other factors which I haven't taken into account. So that's something I'm currently looking at. So I think I'll stop here. Yeah.
So are there any questions? So if there is no any, there's one question.
I don't know anything about these things. Like sort of virus or bacteria, at that level, there is no concept of sex, I suppose.
There is, so once in a while they do indulge in sex. So there is it's a range, it's pretty small, but it's non-zero, that's the point here. So they're not, there is depending upon situations, they do have genetic mixing.
But because at the level of reproduction, I guess, these higher life forms, they are negligible. The virus and bacteria, that,
it's a non-zero number.
Billions of orders of.
Oh, yeah, but it's non-zero. But the question is, why do it at all?
Okay. So thanks the speaker.